In the first video, we discussed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Now, they were ratified in 1791, and what we must keep in mind is this. In 1791, they only applied to white male property owners. Women and any people of color were excluded from these rights and freedoms. Now we're going to look at how they obtained them. In 1865, what we had was the ratification of the 13th Amendment. This amendment abolished slavery, unless it was the penalty for a criminal conviction. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to put a lot of dates up here, but I want everybody to hear this. We're not trying to memorize dates. We're trying to memorize time periods. So you'll notice that a lot of these dates will be mid-1800s, late 1800s, and mid-1900s. Just know the time periods. So 1865, mid-1800s, Civil War is over, and slavery is no longer legal. 3 years later, in 1868, we had the 14th Amendment was passed, and that gave citizenship to all former slaves. And that was because they were born in the United States, and this amendment stated that if you were born here, you're a citizen here, regardless of previous conditions of servitude. So we've got still mid-1800s. 2 years later, in 1870, we had the 15th Amendment passed. That gave suffrage, the right to vote, to former male slaves. Women still were not given the right to vote, but former male slaves now had the right to vote. So we have mid-1800s, freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote for the slaves. Now moving on to the late 1800s, so we're going to check out what became known as the Jim Crow laws. Now, the Jim Crow laws were the laws that allowed for the separation or the segregation of the races. Now, this all came from an 1896 Supreme Court case known as Plessy v. Ferguson that said that blacks and whites were equal under the law, but were not equal in social terms and could therefore be separated out in public. Okay? This is where you had those signs that came about where you'd see whites only, coloreds only. That could be a restaurant, a movie theater, a drinking fountain, a bathroom, schools. This Supreme Court case made segregation legal. Now we're going to look at the women's suffrage movement, because after the male slaves were given the right to vote, women began their movement to obtain that same right. It took them nearly 50 years and a lot of campaigning, but in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, and all people, women included, were now able to vote in a national election. Even though everybody had the right to vote, though, there were certain areas that placed restrictions on this right. Now, if we go back to the 10th Amendment, which we discussed in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment said that states could pass their own laws so long as they didn't violate the Constitution. Well, some states got a little creative with this and thought of ways to restrict the people of color from voting. One of the ways they did this were literacy tests, which was basically just like it sounds, a test seeing whether or not you could read. The problem with it, whites were generally given easy tests with easy questions, whereas people of color were given difficult tests with difficult questions, were unable to answer these questions, and thus were unable to vote. Okay? Another way that states found to restrict the black vote were poll taxes. Because many people of color did not have the same amount of money as white people, they knew that the choice was this: you could either vote or eat tonight. So that would further restrict the people of color from voting in an election. Now, this was primarily done in your southern states. This was not done nationwide, but these were ways that they kind of found a way around the 15th Amendment. Now we're going to move up to the 1960s, okay? The 1960s is when we see the rise of the civil rights movement, the movement to gain voting rights for the people of color. What I would like for everybody to do is this. Part of this module has a little assignment that says Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. I want you to read that letter and see how it would make you feel. Okay, this was written from a jail cell by the leader of the civil rights movement, and it is very, very important to read. Okay, because of the work of Martin Luther King and many other civil rights activists, by 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and that banned discrimination in public places. This is why now when you go to apply for a job, apply for school, go anywhere in public, you see those signs that say we do not discriminate on the basis of race, color, creed, gender, sex. The Civil Rights Act made discrimination illegal. That same year, we had the 24th Amendment passed, and that banned poll taxes. So you can no longer charge somebody to vote. The next year, in 1965, literacy tests were banned by the Voting Rights Act. So here's what I want you to take in. The African Americans were freed in the mid-1800s. Many of them gained the right to vote in the mid-1800s. However, it took nearly 100 years for that full right of suffrage to be enjoyed by people of color.